There's a word you won't find in any medical textbook before roughly 1980. Social anxiety. As a clinical diagnosis, it's younger than the microwave oven, younger than the pocket calculator. It wasn't until 1980 that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-3, formally classified social anxiety disorder as a distinct condition. If you'd walked into a doctor's office in 1985 and said, "I think I have social anxiety disorder," a lot of physicians would have blinked at you. And yet, go back 150 years into the gaslit drawing rooms and fog-wrapped streets of the 19th century, and you'll find people living with something we'd recognize in a heartbeat. People who couldn't cross a public square without their heart trying to climb out of their chest. People who wrote letters instead of speaking. People who, in some cases, simply stopped leaving the house. For years. Sometimes for the rest of their lives. They didn't have our vocabulary. They didn't have a diagnosis or a support group or a prescription. What they had were other words, heavier, stranger, more poetic words. Nervousness, melancholy, delicate constitution, morbid shyness. And when it got severe enough, they had a brand new term, coined in 1871, for the specific terror of open spaces. Here's the thing that fascinates me, and the reason I wanted to make this video. We tend to assume anxiety is a modern disease, a byproduct of smartphones and cortisol and the 24-hour news cycle. That our great-great-grandparents were somehow tougher, calmer, more grounded because their world was slower. That story is comforting. It's also completely wrong. Because when you actually dig into the medical journals, the diaries, the asylum records, and the private letters of the 1800s, you find a century that was drowning in anxiety, a century that invented entire industries around calming the nerves, a century where nervous exhaustion was practically a status symbol among the middle class and a life sentence among the poor. So this is the complete story of what social anxiety disorder looked like before it had a name. We're going to trace how the Victorians understood the racing heart and the dread of being watched. We'll meet the doctors who first tried to map it, the patients who lived it, and the bizarre, sometimes horrifying, sometimes weirdly modern ways they tried to treat it. And by the end, I think you'll see something a little unsettling. That in a lot of ways, they understood this experience better than we give them credit for. And in other ways, they got it catastrophically, tragically wrong. Let's go back to the 19th century. To understand Victorian social anxiety, you have to understand just how much there was to be anxious about. Picture the world these people were living in. The 19th century was, without exaggeration, one of the most disorienting stretches of change in human history. And at the center of it was the Industrial Revolution. In the span of a single lifetime, people went from candlelight and horse-drawn carts to gas lamps, railways, telegraphs, and factories that never slept. Whole villages emptied out as people flooded into cities looking for work. And those cities were loud, crowded, filthy, and full of strangers. That last part matters more than it sounds. For most of human history, you lived and died among people who knew you. Suddenly, millions of people were surrounded, every single day, by faces they'd never see again. You were constantly being observed and judged by strangers whose opinion you couldn't predict and couldn't escape. If you want to design a laboratory for manufacturing social anxiety disorder, that's a pretty good start. Now layer on the rules. Victorian society ran on an almost suffocating code of etiquette. There were correct ways to bow to hand over a calling card, to address someone a rung above or below you on the social ladder. There were rules about who could speak to whom, and when, and about what. Get it wrong, and you didn't just feel embarrassed. You could damage your family's reputation, your marriage prospects, your entire future. The stakes of a social encounter were genuinely enormous. And this pressure fell hardest on two groups. The rising middle class, people who had just clawed their way into respectability and were terrified of slipping back out of it. Every dinner party was an exam they couldn't afford to fail. And women whose entire worth was often measured by how gracefully they performed in social settings, while simultaneously being told that their nerves were fragile, their bodies delicate, and their proper place was quietly at home. Think about the trap there. You're told your value depends on social performance. You're also told you're too fragile to handle the world. That contradiction crushed a lot of people. Then there's the medical backdrop. Disease was everywhere and poorly understood. Cholera could sweep through a neighborhood in days. Childbirth killed. Tuberculosis lingered. Death was a constant, visible presence. Victorians were obsessed with mourning rituals precisely because they had so much to mourn. When the ground beneath your life is that unstable, a baseline hum of dread starts to make a grim kind of sense. So no, these weren't calmer, tougher people living in simpler times. They were people navigating breakneck change, brutal social rules, rigid gender expectations, and constant mortality, all without the psychological language to name what it was doing to them. The anxiety was there. It had to go somewhere. And where it went, the words they reached for, the diagnoses they invented, is where this story gets really interesting. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Because the Victorians didn't have one word for what we'd call social anxiety. They had a whole sprawling vocabulary, and each word tells you something about how they saw it. Let's start with the big one. Nerves. To have bad nerves, or a nervous condition, was the catch-all. It covered everything from mild jitters to full-blown panic to conditions we'd now call depression or PTSD. The nerves were imagined almost like plumbing, a system that could be overtaxed, overloaded, worn thin. And crucially, this framing was physical. Your nerves were part of your body. So being nervous wasn't seen as weakness of character or a moral failing. It was closer to being physically ill. In a strange way, that was more compassionate than how we sometimes talk today. Then there's melancholia, an ancient word the Victorians inherited and ran with. Today, we'd map a lot of it onto depression, but its edges blurred into anxiety, dread, and social withdrawal. The melancholic person was sad, yes, but also often fearful, isolated, unable to face the world. Sound familiar? But the term that really captures the 19th century is neurasthenia. Coined in 1869 by an American physician named George Beard, neurasthenia literally meant weakness of the nerves. Beard's idea was that modern life, all that speed, noise, and pressure of the Industrial Revolution we talked about, was depleting people's finite nervous energy, running them dry. The concept spread quickly across the Atlantic, where the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot helped validate and popularize it in Europe, cementing neurasthenia as an international diagnosis rather than just an American curiosity. And neurasthenia became a phenomenon. It was fashionable almost. Among the middle and upper classes, having neurasthenia signaled that you were sensitive, refined, intellectual, too civilized for the brutal modern world. Writers had it, artists had it. It came with symptoms like exhaustion, anxiety, dread, and a powerful urge to withdraw from society. Doctors prescribed rest, quiet, and retreat, which, if you think about it, could take a socially anxious person and gently wall them off from the world in the name of treatment. That's the middle class version. For the poor, the exact same symptoms rarely got the sympathetic label. They got you called weak, lazy, or hysterical, and sometimes got you committed. Same suffering, very different treatment, depending entirely on your bank account. That gap is one of the quiet tragedies of this whole era. Now, the most specific term, and the one that maps most cleanly onto part of modern anxiety. In 1871, a German physician named Carl Westphal published a study of patients who were seized by overwhelming terror when they tried to cross open public spaces, squares, wide streets, empty plazas. Their hearts pounded, they broke into sweats. They were convinced something catastrophic would happen, what we'd now call panic attacks. Westphal gave it a name built from Greek. Agora, the marketplace, plus phobos, fear. Agoraphobia, fear of the marketplace. In the modern DSM, agoraphobia and panic disorder sit as closely linked conditions. Westphal was essentially observing both at once. And here's what's remarkable. Westphal's descriptions, written over 150 years ago, are so precise that they'd fit almost word for word into a modern clinical manual. He nailed it. The Victorians, for all the concepts they lacked, could observe human suffering with extraordinary clarity when they chose to look. So that's the toolkit. Nerves, melancholia, neurasthenia, agoraphobia. A patchwork of words trying to hold an experience they couldn't quite pin down. But naming a thing is only half the story. The other half is, what did they do about it? And that's where the century gets both ingenious and horrifying. So you're a Victorian. Your heart races at dinner parties, dread follows you out the door, and a doctor has just told you your nerves are worn thin. What happens next? If you were wealthy, and especially if you were a wealthy woman, you might be prescribed the rest cure. This was the era's signature treatment, made famous by an American physician named Silas Weir Mitchell. The idea sounds almost pleasant at first. Total rest. Weeks of it. You'd be put to bed, isolated from friends and family, forbidden from reading, writing, or any stimulation at all, and fed rich, fattening food to rebuild your depleted system. It was a treatment even the young Sigmund Freud took note of, before he went on to develop rather different ideas about what was actually happening inside the anxious mind. In practice, it was closer to solitary confinement. Patients, usually women, were stripped of every source of mental engagement and left alone with their own minds, sometimes for months. The diagnosis that sent them there was often hysteria, a term that itself traced all the way back to Hippocrates in ancient Greece, who attributed it to a wandering uterus. By the Victorian era, the Greek root had been repurposed into a catch-all for any emotional distress in women deemed too dramatic or too nervous. For someone already experiencing what we'd now recognize as social anxiety disorder, being forced into total isolation and told it was medicine could be devastating. One writer, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, went through it and was so shaken that she turned the experience into a now famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, about a woman driven to madness by exactly this treatment. Her verdict on the rest cure was scathing. She said it nearly destroyed her mind. If the rest cure was the premium option, the mass market was tonics and patent medicines. The 19th century was awash in bottled cures for nervous conditions, sold on every corner and in every newspaper ad. Nerve tonics, soothing syrups, restoratives. And here's the dark joke. A huge number of them worked because they were loaded with things like opium, morphine, cocaine, and generous amounts of alcohol. So yes, your anxiety felt better. You were also, quite possibly, becoming an addict without knowing it. An entire generation was quietly medicating dread with substances we now tightly control. Others reached for the era's booming culture of retreat. Spa towns, seaside resorts, taking the waters, long convalescent trips to the countryside or the continent. For those who could afford it, the prescription was essentially leave the pressure cooker for a while. Which, honestly, wasn't the worst instinct. Remove someone from the source of stress and let them recover. The problem was it treated the symptom and left the machinery that caused it fully intact. And then there's the bottom of the ladder. If you were poor and your nervous condition made you unable to work or function, there was no rest cure and no seaside villa. There was the asylum. Victorian asylums swelled enormously across the century, and they swept up a huge range of people, including many whose real condition was severe social anxiety, panic disorder, or the kind of withdrawal we'd now treat with therapy. Once inside, treatment could mean restraint, cold water immersion, forced routines, and confinement that lasted years. The same suffering that made a rich woman delicate could make a poor woman a permanent inmate. Which brings us to the people who slipped through all of it, who found their own solution. Because for a certain kind of Victorian, overwhelmed by a world that felt unbearable to face, there was one option that required no doctor at all. You simply stopped going out. You closed the curtains, dismissed the callers, and made your world very, very small. And some of the most famous names of the 19th century did exactly that. Emily Dickinson is one of the greatest poets in the English language. She's also someone who, by her 30s, had almost entirely withdrawn from the world. In her later years, she rarely left her family's house in Amherst. She spoke to visitors through a door left ajar rather than face them directly. She dressed in white, kept to her room, and poured a torrential inner life onto scraps of paper that almost no one saw while she was alive. We'll never diagnose her across 150 years, and it would be a mistake to try. But the shape of that life, the shrinking world, the dread of direct encounter, the retreat into the safety of walls, is a shape a lot of people with social anxiety disorder today would recognize instantly. And she wasn't alone. The 19th century is dotted with figures who pulled away from society and made their homes into fortresses. Some were wealthy eccentrics who could afford to disappear. Some were writers and thinkers who found the social world simply unbearable. What they shared was a solution that the Victorian world quietly permitted, especially if you had money. You were allowed to just not participate. To become reclusive, a word Victorians used with a mixture of pity, romance, and unease. Here's what strikes me about all of this. The reclusion was, in a sense, rational. If your society has no therapy, no medication that isn't secretly opium, no language to explain what's happening in your chest, and if facing people genuinely feels like standing in front of a firing squad, then withdrawal isn't madness. It's the most logical move available. It was self-protection dressed up as eccentricity. Which leads to the uncomfortable question I promised at the start. How much of this did they actually get right? More than we'd like to admit. They understood that anxiety lived in the body, not just the character, that bad nerves were real and physical, not a personal failing. That's something modern neuroscience has spent decades reconfirming. They understood that the pace and pressure of the Industrial Revolution could genuinely overwhelm a person. And in Westphal's careful notes on agoraphobia, they observed the raw experience with a precision that still holds up. But what they got catastrophically wrong is just as clear. They let your wallet decide whether your suffering was refined sensitivity or grounds for lifelong confinement. They treated people by isolating them further, walling anxious minds into silence and calling it a cure. They handed out addictive drugs like candy, and they built a world so rigid and punishing that vanishing from it entirely could look like the sane choice. So the next time you catch yourself thinking social anxiety disorder is a purely modern affliction, a glitch of the smartphone age, remember the gaslit drawing rooms. Remember the rest cures and the recluses and the fear of the open square. These people felt exactly what we feel. They just had to face it in the dark without a name for it. We at least get to call it what it is.